5 men, 5 farmers who knew the land, who grew up together, who shared secrets only they understood. One autumn, they all vanished, without a trace. No bodies, no goodbyes, just silence. For decades, their families searched for answers, but the truth was buried deeper than the roots of the cottonwood tree where their pact was made. If you want more stories like this, where true crime, mystery, and psychology collide, don't forget to subscribe. The cottonwood tree was older than anyone in the town of Barton Hollow, its gnarled roots clawing deep into the Texas soil, its branches spreading wide like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. Children grew up hearing their grandparents tell stories of the tree's strange pull, that it had watched wagon trains roll west, that cattle rustlers once swung from its thick limbs, that storms seemed to spare the land beneath its canopy while flattening everything around it. But for 5 men in the autumn of 1987, the cottonwood meant something else. It was a meeting place, a landmark where whispers could be exchanged away from wives, children, and neighbors who gossiped about everything in a town too small to keep secrets. That October, harvest season had ended. Fields of cotton lay stripped, stalks brittle underfoot, the air filled with the faint scent of diesel and dust. On the night of October 12th, the men gathered beneath the cottonwood, their pickup trucks forming a rough circle around it. The headlights cut through the darkness, throwing long shadows across the cracked dirt. Sheriff's deputies would later find tire tracks there. They would follow them for a few hundred yards before they disappeared into nothing. 5 trucks had been parked. 5 men had stood there, and not a single one of them came home. When the town woke the next morning, wives found empty beds. Children cried when their fathers didn't return to make breakfast. Neighbors shook their heads, muttering about wild nights and too much whiskey. But by noon, worry had seeped into every household. These weren't boys. These were men who'd been steady their whole lives, hard workers, churchgoers, veterans, providers. They didn't vanish. The sheriff organized search parties. Volunteers scoured miles of farmland, creek beds, and dirt roads. Planes flew overhead, combing the vast stretches of cotton and sorghum fields. Hunters checked old wells and storm drains, places no man should end up but sometimes did. Nothing. No bodies, no trucks, no sign of struggle. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The missing men were Carl Jennings, 52, Vietnam vet, known for his booming laugh and his precision with machinery. David Deke Walker, 44, the youngest of the group, restless and ambitious, eager to sell his land for development. Horace Fields, 60, a quiet, weathered man whose family had farmed Barton Hollow soil since before the Civil War. Tommy Harlan, 49, the practical one, keeper of books and ledgers who mistrusted anyone in a suit. Earl Branson, 55, heavy-set, fond of bourbon, with a temper that could flare but a loyalty that ran bone deep. Together they'd been friends since boyhood. Together, they vanished. The story made headlines across Texas. 5 farmers missing in Barton Hollow, read the Austin American-Statesman. Rumors bloomed like weeds. Some swore it was drug smugglers, that the men had stumbled onto a hidden airstrip or cartel stash. Others whispered about cults. The cottonwood tree had long been the subject of superstition. A few insisted the men had simply left, running from debts or family obligations, maybe chasing something better in Mexico. But their families knew better. Bills went unpaid. Harvests rotted in the fields. None of the men touched their bank accounts or used their credit cards again. They had simply stopped existing. Decades passed. The cottonwood tree still stood, though storms had split one limb and lightning had scarred its trunk. Children grew up, left town, and returned for funerals. Wives of the missing men aged into widows, their lives marked by the absence of bodies to bury. Newcomers to Barton Hollow heard the tale and dismissed it as folklore, another Texas ghost story. But some never stopped searching. Margaret Jennings, Carl's daughter, grew up with the mystery wrapped around her like barbed wire. She had been only 12 when her father disappeared, old enough to remember his scent of motor oil and tobacco, too young to understand why he never came home. As the years passed, her grief hardened into determination. She kept clippings of every article, filed requests for police reports, and badgered aging deputies who muttered the same words. No leads, no evidence. By the year 2005, Barton Hollow was a shadow of the town it had been. The cotton gin had closed, the grain elevator stood rusting, and half the storefronts downtown sat empty. Yet the cottonwood tree still spread its branches wide, casting its shadow over the very place 5 men had last stood alive. And that was where the first clue resurfaced. It was a warm October afternoon, eerily similar to that long-ago harvest season. A drought had cracked the earth around Barton Hollow, draining creeks to puddles and leaving cattle bawling for water. A construction company arrived on the outskirts of town to dig the first foundations for a planned highway bypass. Locals grumbled. It would cut straight across the land once owned by the missing men, sold off by their families in the years after their disappearance. The backhoe clawed at the soil, metal teeth screeching. After only a few hours, the machine struck something solid. The operator cursed, assuming it was limestone or a buried stump. But when the bucket lifted, a human skull rolled into the dirt. The site was shut down. State investigators were called, and the story of Barton Hollow's 5 vanished farmers, long relegated to whispers, came roaring back into the headlines. DNA testing identified the skull as belonging to Deke Walker, the youngest of the 5. He had been buried barely 2 feet beneath the soil, shallow enough that roots had tangled through his ribcage. Alongside him were fragments of clothing, a belt buckle, scuffed boots, the rusted buckle of overalls. There was no sign of his truck, no other remains. Just Deke. The families reeled. For nearly 20 years, they had lived with a void. Now one piece of the puzzle had surfaced, but it only raised more questions. Why was Deke buried alone? Where were the others? And most importantly, what had they all been doing out by the cottonwood tree that night in 1987? The sheriff's office had no answers, but one retired deputy, long considered eccentric, came forward with a story he had never told in full. He remembered seeing the men at the cottonwood that night, gathered in a circle, their voices low. He'd parked a half-mile away, watching them through binoculars, too ashamed to admit he'd been drinking and too nervous to approach. He swore they'd been arguing. Swore he'd heard words carried on the wind, words like promise, bury it, and never tell. Whatever pact they made that night had ended in their disappearance. And now, as the soil gave up its first secret, Barton Hollow was about to learn that some pacts don't stay buried forever. The autumn sun baked the streets of Barton Hollow as Margaret Jennings pulled her car into the cracked lot of the old sheriff's office. The building looked smaller than she remembered. Its faded brick walls and leaning flagpoles sagged with the weight of decades. Dust clung to the steps, and the windows were cloudy, as if the place had given up trying to see clearly anymore. She shut off the ignition and sat for a long moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine. Her hands stayed fixed on the steering wheel, knuckles pale, heart thudding in her chest. She hadn't been back here in nearly 15 years, not since she'd stormed through those doors as a teenager, demanding answers the deputies couldn't give. The years hadn't dulled the ache. If anything, the discovery of Deke Walker's remains had sharpened it into something unbearable. Deke had been her father's closest friend, the joker of the group, the one who'd slip candy to Margaret when her mother wasn't looking. Finding him buried in a shallow grave only confirmed what she'd feared all her life. Whatever happened beneath that cottonwood tree had been violent, and her father had been part of it. The question was whether he'd been a victim, or something worse. Margaret drew a breath and opened the car door. The heat slammed into her, carrying the dry metallic scent of dust and cotton. Barton Hollow hadn't changed much, though it looked emptier. The diner where her father used to buy her ice cream was boarded up. The hardware store's windows displayed yellowed closing sale. Signs that had been there so long they were part of the scenery. Even the church steeple looked crooked, as though God himself had stopped paying attention to the town. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was cool but stale. A young deputy behind the desk looked up, startled, as if he wasn't used to visitors. His nameplate read, Coleman. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. Margaret's voice came out steady despite the knots in her stomach. "I need to see Sheriff Cole." The deputy blinked. Sheriff Cole's been retired for years. Margaret hesitated. Then whoever's running this place now. The deputy looked uncertain but finally rose, disappearing through a side door. Margaret glanced around the lobby. The same wood-paneled walls, the same bulletin board with curling flyers about lost dogs and bake sales. But the faces were different. None of the deputies she remembered remained. Time had wiped the slate clean, except for her. When the deputy returned, he was followed by a tall man with silvering hair and a careful expression. He extended a hand. "Sheriff Warren, you must be Margaret Jennings." His grip was firm, his gaze steady, but Margaret caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Not recognition of her face. Recognition of the name. Everyone in Barton Hollow knew it. "I came as soon as I heard," she said. "About Deke Walker?" She nodded. The sheriff motioned toward his office. Inside, he closed the door and gestured for her to sit. His desk was stacked with reports, folders spilling over like he was drowning in paperwork. The blinds were half drawn, stripes of sunlight cutting across the room. "I know this must be hard," Warren began. "After all these years—" "It's not hard," Margaret interrupted, surprising even herself. "It's worse than that. It's unfinished." They found one of them. Sheriff. One. And no one can tell me what happened to the others. Or my father Warren's jaw tightened. "We're treating this as an active investigation. The Rangers are involved now. Forensic teams are combing the site. But it may take time." Margaret leaned forward, her voice sharp. "We've had 20 years of time. My mother died without knowing. Half the family's moved away. You think we can wait another decade for someone to stumble over another skull?" The sheriff studied her, weighing something. Finally, he sighed. "Off the record, Margaret. Sometimes these cases aren't about what we can prove in court. Sometimes they're about what people were willing to bury." The word hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's pulse quickened. "You think they made some kind of pact, don't you?" Warren didn't answer immediately. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a file, sliding it across the desk. "This is from an old deputy's notes." He swore he saw the men together that night, heard them arguing. He wrote down what little he caught. Margaret opened the file. The paper inside was yellowed, the ink faded but legible. Words scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Promise, bury it, never tell." Her throat tightened. She looked up. "Never tell what?" "That's what we're trying to find out." By evening, Margaret was back at the Cottonwood tree. The construction site had been roped off, but she parked on the shoulder and walked past the barriers. The air smelled of clay and diesel. The sun had dropped low, painting the horizon in bands of orange and violet. She stopped at the base of the tree. Its bark was rough under her hand, scarred with initials carved decades ago. She recognized some of them. Boys she'd gone to school with, couples who'd left town, even her father's name once etched alongside her mother's. But near the roots, where the soil had been disturbed, the ground seemed to breathe. The dirt was looser, darker, as if it still remembered what had been hidden beneath it. Margaret crouched, touching the earth. She closed her eyes, imagining 5 men standing here in the dark, arguing, sweating, swearing something they couldn't unsay. Her chest tightened. For the first time, she wondered if her father hadn't just been a victim. What if he'd been part of whatever they buried? The thought left her cold. Night settled over Barton Hollow. Margaret drove back through town, headlights sweeping across empty storefronts and sagging porches. The silence pressed in, broken only by the hum of cicadas. At a stoplight, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her hair was streaked with gray now, her face lined with years of waiting. She barely recognized herself. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A man's voice rasped through static. "Margaret Jennings?" Her breath caught. "Who is this?" The pause on the line stretched long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then softly, "You want answers about your daddy? Meet me tomorrow, midnight, by the gin." The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her pulse thundering. The gin had been closed for years, its machinery rusting, its walls collapsing. No one went there anymore. Whoever had called her knew that, and they knew her name. She tightened her grip on the wheel, heart pounding. The Cottonwood had given up its first secret. Now someone in Barton Hollow was ready to give up another, but at what cost? The old cotton gin loomed like a skeleton against the night sky, its rusted frame cutting jagged shapes into the moonlight. Margaret parked a block away, headlights off, and walked the rest of the distance. Her shoes crunched softly against gravel, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. The gin had been closed since she was a teenager, its machines long gutted, its windows shattered. For kids, it had been a place of dares and drunken bravado. For adults, it was a ruin, best avoided. Tonight it felt like a trap. She checked her phone. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes. She slipped it back into her pocket and scanned the shadows. The wind moved through the broken slats, making the building groan as though it still remembered the weight of decades of harvests. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, then fell silent. Margaret's pulse hammered in her ears. She thought about driving away, telling herself it had been a prank, a cruel call meant to rattle her. But the voice had known her name. And more than that, it had promised answers about her father. Headlights appeared down the road. A truck. Its engine rumbled low, drawing closer until it rolled to a stop beside the gin. The driver cut the lights, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Then the door creaked open. A man stepped out, his silhouette tall but stooped at the shoulders. He wore a ball cap pulled low, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. His boots scuffed against the gravel as he approached. "Margaret Jennings?" he asked. She forced her voice to stay calm. "Depends who's asking." The man tugged off his cap. In the pale moonlight, she saw a face lined with age, stubble gone gray, eyes tired but sharp. Recognition struck her. "Dean Holloway," she whispered. He nodded once. Dean had been a farmhand in Barton Hollow his whole life. She remembered him from her childhood, quiet, reliable, always helping at harvest. He had vanished from town not long after the 5 farmers disappeared, moving to some county up north. People had said he couldn't handle the gossip, that he'd run from his own debts. And yet here he was, back after decades. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. Dean's gaze flicked toward the gin, then back to her. "Because I was there that night." Margaret's breath caught. "You saw them?" she asked. "I saw more than that," Dean said, his voice low. "I heard what they did, and I've kept my mouth shut for 20 years, but now—" He hesitated, glancing around as if the shadows were listening. "Now Deke's bones have come up, and I reckon the rest will too." Margaret's heart pounded. "What did they do?" Dean shifted his weight, the gravel crunching beneath his boot. His eyes darted back to the gin, then to her again. It wasn't just about farming, or land, or money. It was about what they found buried out there, and what they swore never to tell. Margaret stepped closer, her voice urgent. "Tell me, Dean. Please. I've lived my whole life not knowing." Dean's jaw tightened. Not here. Not tonight. Too many ears. Meet me tomorrow morning at the Old Fields property by the silo. I'll show you." Before she could respond, he pulled the cap low again, turned, and climbed back into his truck. The engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed as he pulled away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the moonlight, the gin looming behind her like a silent witness. She felt the weight of the night pressing in. Whatever Dean Holloway knew, it was enough to bring him back after decades, enough to risk speaking after all this time, and enough, perhaps, to put him in danger. The next morning, Margaret drove toward the Fields farm, the landscape rolling out in stretches of cotton stubble and brittle sorghum stalks. The farmhouse stood empty now, windows dark, roof sagging. Horace Fields' descendants had long since left town, the land sold and resold, until it became little more than a tax write-off. The silo, though, still stood, tall, rusted, its white paint flaking. Dean's truck was already there. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon. When Margaret pulled up, he gave a short nod but didn't move. "You sure you want to hear this?" he asked as she stepped out. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." Dean studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, but you'd best understand, once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And there are folks in this county who'd rather it stayed buried." Margaret braced herself. "Tell me." Dean's gaze drifted toward the silo. "It started with Horace. He came across something while plowing, late summer of '87. Said it was bones, human bones. He called the others Carl, Deke, Tommy, Earl. They met under the Cottonwood to talk about it." Margaret's skin prickled. "What kind of bones?" she asked. Dean's voice dropped. "A child's. Maybe more than one. Old, though. Been in the ground a long time. Horace didn't want trouble. None of them did. This land's history is tangled. Comanche raids, feuds, killings nobody ever wrote down. They figured it was best to keep it quiet." Her stomach churned. "So they made a pact." Dean nodded. "Under that tree, they swore not to tell. Said they'd bury it again, deeper this time, pretend it never happened. But Deke, he didn't like it. He wanted to call the sheriff. Said keeping quiet was a sin. And then?" Margaret whispered. Dean's eyes hardened. "Then Deke disappeared, and so did the rest." The silence stretched, heavy as the sky. Margaret felt her breath quicken. "Are you saying they killed each other?" Dean shook his head. "No, I'm saying someone else didn't like them finding those bones. Someone older, someone who already knew they were there." Margaret's pulse raced. "Who?" Dean's gaze flicked toward the horizon, toward the distant Cottonwood. His voice was almost a whisper. "That's the part I never dared say. Because whoever it was, they're still here. And they don't want the truth coming out." Margaret's skin went cold. Dean pushed off the truck, climbing into the cab. "Stay away from that tree, Margaret. If you know what's good for you." The engine rumbled, and he pulled away, leaving her standing in the shadow of the rusted silo, the weight of his words pressing down on her like the Texas sun. That evening, Margaret sat at her mother's old kitchen table, papers spread around her, news clippings, photographs, notes she'd kept since she was 12. Her fingers traced the faces of the 5 missing men. Her father smiled in every picture, mustache thick, eyes warm. She tried to imagine him arguing under that cottonwood tree, his voice raised in fear or anger. Bones. A child's bones, buried on Horace Fields' land. If Dean was telling the truth, then her father and his friends hadn't vanished because of debts or feuds. They'd vanished because they'd stumbled onto something older, something darker. She poured herself coffee and stared at the notes until her eyes blurred. The clock ticked loud on the wall. Just after midnight, her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Her stomach tightened as she answered. A woman's voice, low and urgent. "Margaret." Don't trust Dean Holloway. He's not telling you everything." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" But the line had already gone dead. She sat in the silence, her heart pounding, the coffee cooling at her side. The cottonwood tree stood out there in the darkness, its roots tangled in secrets. And now she was caught in them too. The cottonwood tree stood alone at the edge of the abandoned field's property, its branches twisted like gnarled arms, leaves whispering in the wind. Even from the road, Margaret could see it rising against the dusk sky, larger than she remembered, as if it had fed on the decades of silence. She parked the sedan just past the gate and climbed out. The grass was high, brittle and gold, brushing against her jeans as she walked. The air smelled of dust and old earth. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, its wings dark against the horizon. Margaret's father had told her stories of this land when she was a child, of harvests that failed, of neighbors who feuded over water rights, of a barn that had burned one summer in the 50s. But he had never mentioned anything about bones. Now, standing at the property line, she wondered what else he had kept from her. She carried a flashlight and a small spade she'd found in her mother's shed. The plan had come to her in a restless haze the night before. If Dean Holloway wouldn't say more, she would go herself. She needed to see, needed proof. The cottonwood loomed closer, its roots thick, breaking the earth like bones themselves. She placed her palm against the rough bark. It was warm from the day's sun, and the tree seemed to hum faintly under her touch. A trick of nerves, she told herself. She knelt by the roots and began to dig. The spade bit into the dry soil, breaking it apart in chunks. The earth smelled strong, metallic. She worked slowly, listening for every rustle, every crack of twig in the field. Half an hour passed. Sweat dripped down her temples, streaking her shirt. She was about to stop, about to tell herself this was madness, when the spade struck something hard. She froze. The sound rang sharper than rock. She cleared the dirt with her hands, her breath catching. White, not stone, not wood. White, porous, unmistakable. Margaret's throat tightened. She pushed away more soil until the curve of a small skull emerged, hollow sockets staring up at her through the dark. The earth gave way around ribs, brittle and fragile, collapsed in on themselves. She drew back, shaking. It was a child. She scrambled to her feet, the flashlight trembling in her grip. Every instinct told her to run, to get back in the car and drive, but her legs felt heavy, rooted like the cottonwood itself. A sound broke the silence. Crunch. Gravel shifting on the road. Margaret snapped her light off and ducked low, heart hammering. Through the tall grass, she saw headlights approaching, slow, deliberate. A truck. Dean's truck. She crouched behind the tree as it rolled to a stop. The engine cut, and for a moment, the only sound was the tick of cooling metal. Then the driver's door opened. Dean Holloway stepped out, but he wasn't alone. A second man followed, taller, broad-shouldered. His face stayed in shadow, but his voice carried across the field. "You sure she'll come?" the man asked. "She's already been sniffing around," Dean replied. "Saw her car near the silo yesterday." Margaret's chest constricted. "She won't find what we buried," the tall man said. "Not unless we let her." Dean spat into the dirt. "She's persistent." Just like her daddy. Maybe too much for her own good. The men stood in silence, staring toward the cottonwood. Margaret pressed herself against the bark, praying they wouldn't step closer. Finally, the tall man clapped Dean on the shoulder. "We'll take care of it tomorrow. Tonight, we keep quiet." They turned back toward the truck, their boots crunching on gravel. Doors slammed, the engine roared, and the truck pulled away, its red tail lights shrinking until they disappeared into the dark. Margaret stayed frozen long after they were gone, her pulse racing, the air thick in her lungs. Only when the field fell completely silent again did she dare to move. She crouched back to the shallow hole. The skull stared up at her, pale against the soil, Beside it, something caught the beam of her flashlight. A small object half buried in the dirt. She brushed it free. A shoe. Tiny, cracked with age, the leather stiff and brittle. Margaret clutched it in trembling hands. The size was no bigger than an 8-year-old's. Her father's voice whispered in her memory. "Lucia never goes anywhere without her shoes shined, Maggie. She's proud of them." Her throat burned. This wasn't just a secret of the past. It was tied to her father, to the day he vanished, to the pact under this very tree. And now she knew too much. She drove home in silence, the shoe wrapped in an old rag on the passenger seat, her hands gripping the wheel until her knuckles turned white. The road blurred, headlights carving the night. She half expected Dean's truck to appear in her rearview mirror, but the highway remained empty. When she finally pulled into her driveway, exhaustion hit her like a wave. She carried the shoe inside, placed it carefully on the kitchen table, and sat staring at it for a long time. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Every creak of the walls, every groan of the settling wood made her flinch. She checked the locks twice, pulled the curtains shut, then sat back at the table. The shoe lay there like an accusation. She picked up her phone and opened the number of the sheriff's office. Her thumb hovered over the call button. If she reported this, Dean and whoever he was with would know. They'd come for her. But if she stayed silent, she'd become part of the pact herself. Her thumb pressed the button. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. Not the dispatcher she expected, but a low, drawling, male voice. "You shouldn't have gone digging, Margaret." She froze. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled, dark and cold. "Some things stay buried for a reason." The line went dead. Margaret dropped the phone as though it had burned her. The shoe stared back at her from the table, a relic of a child whose bones still lay under the cottonwood. And she realized, with a sinking dread, that the pact wasn't just about the past. It was alive, still being kept, still being enforced. Margaret barely slept. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the hollow sockets of the child's skull, the brittle shoe resting in the dirt, Dean's voice carrying in the wind. She lay on the couch instead of her bed, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the shoe sealed inside a paper grocery bag on the table. The phone call replayed in her mind over and over. "You shouldn't have gone digging, Margaret." The voice had been disguised, muffled maybe, but familiar in a way that made her skin crawl. She wondered if she'd heard it at church once, or at the farmer's market, or maybe in line at the hardware store. Someone local. Someone who knew her well enough to use her first name. By sunrise, her decision was made. She wouldn't call the sheriff's office again. Not yet. Not when Dean had such easy access to them. Not when men like him had been woven into the county's fabric for generations. Reporting the shoe to them might just hand it back into the very hands that buried it. She needed someone outside, someone who owed no loyalty to Cottonwood County. By late morning, she found herself parked outside the modest brick bungalow of Jonah Price, a retired reporter who had once written for the Austin Chronicle. Jonah had lived through enough scandals to know how to sniff out a story, and though his retirement had been quiet, Margaret had remembered an old column he'd written about rural land disputes, one that had briefly touched on the missing farmers back in the 80s. She sat in the car a long time before gathering the courage to knock. Jonah's yard was cluttered with wind chimes and rusting lawn ornaments, the porch sagging under the weight of forgotten tools. When he opened the door, he looked older than she remembered. Hair thinning, beard untended, glasses slipping down his nose. "Margaret Halbrook," he said, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Haven't seen you since your father's service. I need your help," she blurted. Jonah studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Better come in, then." His living room smelled faintly of old books and coffee grounds. Stacks of newspapers and file boxes covered every surface, towers leaning precariously. Margaret perched on the edge of a worn armchair while Jonah settled into the couch, a notebook already in his lap. "What brings you here? After all this time?" She took a breath, steadying herself. "You wrote about the disappearances, the 5 farmers Jonah's pen stilled. That was a long time ago. The Fields brothers, the Rileys, old man Barrett, and your father's friend Lewis, all gone in the same season." "Yes." Her hands trembled in her lap. I think I found something connected to them." She reached into the grocery bag and pulled out the shoe, placing it carefully on the coffee table. Jonah leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "Where'd you get this?" "By the cottonwood tree on the Fields property. I was digging and there were bones. A child's." Jonah didn't speak for a long moment. He ran his fingers gently over the cracked leather, the way one might touch a relic. "You didn't call the sheriff?" "I tried." Her voice cracked. "But someone answered." "Not the dispatcher. He knew my name. He told me I shouldn't have gone digging." Jonah sat back slowly, his gaze sharpening. "That tree." "The one they all used to meet under. You know the story?" Margaret shook her head. "They called it the Cottonwood Pact. Old-timers said the farmers swore loyalty there, promised to protect each other's land no matter what. Folks thought it was about standing up against outside developers, but I always suspected it was darker than that." Margaret's skin prickled. "Darker how?" Jonah hesitated, then said quietly, "Rumors. That someone was killed. That the pact wasn't just about land, it was about keeping silent, about covering up something they'd done." Margaret's breath caught. "And my father?" Jonah's eyes softened. "He was close to them." "Closer than most. If he knew what they did, it might explain why he disappeared too." The room seemed to tilt. For years she'd clung to the image of her father as an innocent man, swallowed by mystery. Now the possibility that he'd been complicit gnawed at her, sharp and cruel. "I need to know the truth," she whispered. Jonah tapped his pen against the notebook, a steady, thoughtful rhythm. "Then you'll need records. Old land deeds, police reports, anything the county tried to bury. Lucky for you, I never throw anything away." They spent the afternoon combing through his boxes. Dust rose in clouds as Margaret flipped through brittle clippings. The names repeated like echoes. Fields. Riley, Barrett, Halbrook. Always tied to disputes over water rights, acreage boundaries, inheritance squabbles. One article caught her eye. Local farmer's daughter missing after storm, 1972. She skimmed it, her pulse quickening. The girl had been 8 years old, the daughter of a Riley. Disappeared after a flood swept through their property. Authorities blamed the river. Margaret looked at the shoe again. Could it have belonged to her? Jonah read over her shoulder. "I always thought that case stank. The family was quick to call it an accident. Too quick." "And then a decade later," Margaret murmured, 5 men vanish." The same families connected. Jonah nodded grimly. "It fits." By the time Margaret drove home, her trunk was loaded with boxes of photocopied records Jonah insisted she borrow. The sky had gone heavy with clouds, thunder rumbling low in the distance. She carried the boxes inside one by one, stacking them in the kitchen. But as she returned for the last load, she froze on the porch. A truck idled across the street. Its lights were off, but she could make out the outline of a figure behind the wheel, watching. Her chest tightened. She fumbled for her keys, heart pounding, and ducked back inside, slamming the door and locking it. Through the curtains, she watched the truck linger for what felt like an eternity before it finally rolled away. She leaned against the door, trembling. The pact wasn't just history. It was alive, and someone was making sure she knew it. That night the storm broke. Rain hammered the roof. Wind rattled the shutters. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, papers spread before her, lightning casting brief flashes over the headlines. 5 farmers missing. Sheriff says no foul play suspected. Community in mourning. Her father's name surfaced again and again, always at the edges of the story. Never accused, never suspected, but always present, always nearby. She stared at an old photograph clipped from the Chronicle. The 5 missing men stood in front of the cottonwood tree, arms linked, smiles wide. And there, just off to the side, was her father. His smile didn't reach his eyes. The thunder rolled, and the shoe sat on the table like a ghost of a child who had never come home. Margaret whispered into the storm, though there was no one to hear her. "Daddy, what did you do?" The rain hadn't stopped by morning. It pounded steady against the roof, turning the yard into a shallow lake. Margaret hadn't slept. She dozed in her chair at the kitchen table, jerking awake at every crack of thunder, at every shadow cast by lightning across the curtains. The boxes from Jonah sat in a messy sprawl. She'd marked pages with sticky notes, lined up clippings that made the pattern clearer with each connection. Disputes, deaths, disappearances. Always the same cluster of families, always around that tree. Her nerves were frayed raw. By mid-morning, she decided she needed fresh air. She carried her mug of coffee to the porch, staring at the empty street. The truck from the night before was gone, but its memory lingered like a stain. She told herself to be rational. Maybe it was just a neighbor, maybe coincidence. But the voice on the phone echoed in her skull. You shouldn't have gone digging. By noon, the storm slowed. Clouds thinned, leaving a gray wash over the town. Margaret dragged herself upstairs, intending to nap for real this time. She drew the curtains, shut the bedroom door, and lay across the quilt. Her body felt leaden, her mind spinning. Sleep came, but it was shallow, restless. She dreamed of the cottonwood tree growing taller and taller, its roots wrapping around her house, bursting through the floorboards, skeletal hands rising from the soil. She woke with a jolt. The room was dark. She checked the clock, 2:37 a.m. Her ears picked up something odd. A faint scrape, the sound of wood against wood. Downstairs. Margaret held her breath. Another sound followed. A slow, deliberate creak. The back door. Her pulse hammered. She slipped from bed, bare feet silent on the carpet, and grabbed the flashlight from her dresser. She didn't dare turn it on. Instead, she crept to the stairwell and crouched, listening. The kitchen floor groaned under weight. Someone was inside. Margaret's first thought was the shoe on the table, the clippings spread across the counter. Evidence. She needed to protect them. She descended one step at a time, careful to avoid the loose board near the middle. The flashlight trembled in her grip. From the kitchen came a faint rustle, like paper shifting. Then glass clinked. Margaret's throat tightened. She crouched low at the bottom of the stairs, peering into the dark. The silhouette of a man moved across the kitchen, tall, shoulders broad. Not Dean. Different build. He rifled through the papers, shoving some into a bag slung across his chest. Margaret's mouth went dry. She considered running out the front door, but the key was in the bowl beside the intruder. She was trapped. The man turned, his face briefly illuminated by lightning through the window. Margaret caught only fragments. A scar along the jawline, a cap pulled low, eyes cold and flat. He paused, stiffened. Margaret realized the shoe was gone. The bag on his shoulder bulged. Panic surged. Without thinking, she snapped on the flashlight and shone it straight into his face. "Get out!" she shouted, voice breaking. The man flinched, raising an arm against the beam. For one frozen second, they stared at each other across the kitchen. Then he moved. Fast. Margaret stumbled back, heart slamming against her ribs. She darted for the stairs as the man lunged. His boots thundered after her. She reached the landing, slammed her bedroom door, and shoved a chair against the knob. Wood splintered as he rammed it. Margaret snatched her phone from the nightstand, fingers fumbling. The call rang once before connecting. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone, she gasped, but the words died as the line went dead. Static. Then silence. He'd cut the phone. The door shuddered under another blow. The chair legs screeched. Margaret grabbed the heavy lamp from the dresser, clutching it like a weapon. "Leave me alone!" she screamed. The pounding stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. She strained to hear, her own breath ragged in her ears. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, retreating down the stairs. The back door creaked again, slammed shut. She stayed frozen until dawn bled gray through the curtains. By morning, the kitchen was a wreck. Papers scattered, boxes overturned, mud tracked across the floor. The shoe was gone. Several of Jonah's clippings missing too. Whoever the man was, he'd known exactly what to take. Margaret slumped against the counter, trembling. She should call Jonah, warn him. But the fear of dragging him into danger knotted her stomach. Instead, she cleaned. Slowly, methodically, as though restoring order could erase the violation. She scrubbed the muddy prints, stacked the papers, swept away the shards of glass from a broken tumbler. But no matter how hard she cleaned, the smell lingered. Damp soil, sweat, intrusion. When she finally sank into a chair, exhaustion pulling at her bones, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a pact between farmers. It was bigger, older, deeper. And now it had her in its grip. Jonah Price didn't answer her first call, or the second. By the third attempt, Margaret's hand shook so badly she almost dropped the phone. When his voice finally came through, groggy and gravelly, she nearly broke down with relief. "Jonah, it's me. Someone broke into my house last night. They took the shoe, some of the clippings too." Silence stretched across the line. Then Jonah said, low and steady, "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The old reporter arrived in less than 15, his car rumbling to a stop outside her driveway. He looked different in daylight, hair sticking out in tufts, jacket hanging off thin shoulders. But his eyes were sharp as ever, scanning the street before he even approached the door. Margaret let him in. He took in the kitchen with one glance, the scrubbed floor, the scattered papers still in slight disarray, and exhaled. "They were careful," he muttered. "Knew what to take. Did you see him?" Margaret hesitated. Tall, scar along the jaw, wore a cap low. He didn't say anything, but he knew what he wanted. Jonah scribbled in his notebook, the page already filled with cramped handwriting. That wasn't some random thief. That was someone tied to this. They wanted the shoe because it could prove a child died out there. Margaret slumped into a chair. "What do I do? I can't go to the sheriff. I can't even call 911. The line cut off before I got a word out." Jonah set down his pen. "Then you don't go to them." "Not yet. We work quiet. We dig deeper than they expect." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a folder. "I didn't tell you yesterday, but I've been keeping tabs on Dean Holloway for years. He was the youngest of the pact. Tried to walk away once in the 90s, but something pulled him back. Bank records, land deeds, he's tied to all of it." Margaret's stomach twisted. "He was at the tree. I heard him talking to another man. They knew I'd been out there." Jonah's eyes flicked up. "Then we've got less time than I thought." That afternoon, they pored over the folder together. The documents painted a web Margaret hadn't expected. Holloway Farms tied to Riley Cotton, Barrett Feed, and Fields Grain. Interconnected loans, mysterious payoffs, sudden debt relief. Always balanced like pieces of a puzzle no outsider could understand. And threaded through it all, dates that matched the disappearances. Jonah tapped one ledger with his pen. "See this? October 1983. 5 months before they vanished, A loan is forgiven for the Barrett family. No paperwork, no explanation. The same week, a Riley cousin is killed in a supposed hunting accident. Convenient, isn't it? Margaret leaned closer. The ink was faded, but the number leapt at her. $10,000. Enough to buy silence. Her father's name appeared on the next page, listed as guarantor on a loan that vanished into thin air. Margaret's throat tightened. So he knew about this. He was part of it. Jonah placed a hand gently on hers. Don't jump to conclusions. Maybe he was caught up in it. Maybe he wanted out. That's why we dig. To find the truth, but his eyes told her he wasn't certain. Evening fell heavy, shadows stretching across the kitchen. Margaret lit a lamp, the glow casting their papers into sharp relief. A knock at the door startled them both. Margaret froze. Jonah held up a finger, motioning for silence. He crept to the window, peering through the curtain. A woman stood on the porch, late 50s, her raincoat dripping from the drizzle that had returned. She clutched a paper sack to her chest like a lifeline. Jonah frowned. That's Clara Riley, widow of one of the packed men. She hasn't spoken about it in decades. Margaret's pulse quickened. She moved to the door and opened it cautiously. Mrs. Riley? The woman's eyes darted around the street before she pushed inside. She smelled faintly of rain and mothballs, her face pale and drawn. They're watching me, Clara whispered. I saw you with Jonah yesterday. You need to be careful. Dean doesn't forgive questions. Margaret guided her to a chair. Please, sit. What do you know? Clara set the sack on the table and unrolled it. Inside lay a bundle of yellowed letters, tied with string. My husband wrote these before he vanished, she said, voice trembling. I never showed anyone. If Dean knew, he'd kill me. Margaret's fingers shook as she untied the bundle. The handwriting was faded but legible. Lines of fear etched across every page. They made me swear under the tree. Said it was for the land. But it wasn't. It was for the girl. We can't talk about her. We can't even say her name. If anyone breaks the pact, they'll bury us too. Margaret's vision blurred. The child's skull, the shoe, the erased name. It all clicked into place. Jonah read over her shoulder, his face grim. This proves it. They didn't just vanish. They were silenced. Clara wrung her hands. I don't want to be next. I shouldn't have come. Margaret gripped her hand. You did the right thing. This could bring them down. But even as she said it, fear coiled in her gut. Because the pact hadn't faded with time. It was alive, breathing, watching, and now it knew exactly who had broken the silence. Rain tapped steadily against the windows as Margaret spread Clara's letters across the kitchen table. The handwriting trembled on every page, the ink blotched in places where sweat or tears had smudged it. Jonah leaned close, his pen scratching notes in the margin of his notebook. Clara sat hunched in the corner, wringing her hands, her eyes darting to the window as though she expected headlights to sweep the street at any moment. Margaret picked up the first letter. October 3rd, 1987. They called us to the tree again. Horace says it's just a matter of loyalty, but Deke isn't sleeping. He mutters about what's under the ground. I told him to hush before Dean heard, but he wouldn't. He says we're cursed if we stay quiet. Maybe he's right. Maybe we already are. Her hands shook as she passed it to Jonah. He read quickly, jaw tightening. This isn't just rumor, he muttered. This is confession. Margaret unfolded another. October 10th, 1987. The girl. She wasn't from here. Horace found her bones first, but there are more. Too many. We argued till dawn. Earl says it's none of our concern, but Carl wanted to tell someone. If he had, maybe we wouldn't be trapped now. Maybe they wouldn't have sworn us all to silence. Margaret pressed a fist to her mouth, fighting nausea. Her father's name burned on the page. He had wanted to tell. That small shred of truth steadied her, even as dread closed in. Jonah tapped the letter. This girl, they never name her. Whoever she was, her death bound them together, and whoever enforced the pact made sure they never broke it. Clara flinched. You don't understand. My husband wasn't a bad man. He was scared. They all were. Dean said if anyone spoke out, they'd end up in the dirt same as the girl. Margaret reached for her hand. Clara, you're safe here. But even as she said it, the thought curdled. Safe was a lie. The storm let up by midnight. Clara dozed fitfully in the armchair while Margaret and Jonah sifted through the letters, piecing together a timeline. Notice the dates, Jonah said. 2 days before they vanished, he writes about Carl. Your father wanted to go to the sheriff. That could be why they all disappeared together, because he wouldn't stay quiet. Margaret stared at the words until they blurred. Her father had been brave, not complicit. The thought filled her chest with a painful kind of hope. A car engine rumbled outside. Jonah stiffened. He moved to the window, peering through the curtain. A black pickup idled across the street, headlights off. Margaret's stomach dropped. That's the same one from before. Jonah's voice was flat. They've been watching. The truck lingered, silent, menacing. Then its headlights flared on, blinding white through the window. Clara jerked awake with a gasp. Jonah pulled Margaret back from the glass. Get down! The truck revved, tires spitting gravel, and peeled away into the night. The echo of its engine rattled the quiet house long after it was gone. Margaret's heart pounded. Clara wept silently in the chair. They're not going to let this go, Jonah said grimly. We've poked the hive. Now they know it. The next morning, Clara insisted on leaving. If I stay, they'll come for me. They always do. Margaret tried to protest, but Clara's eyes were fierce, her voice steady. I've carried this for decades. If it ends with me, so be it. But you have to finish what your father started. She pressed one final letter into Margaret's hands before she left, her grip surprisingly strong. Read this one last. When you're ready. Then she was gone, her small frame swallowed by the drizzle, her raincoat flapping in the wind. Margaret stood at the door, the letter heavy in her palm. Jonah's voice was quiet. She won't last long on her own. Margaret's throat tightened. Neither will we. That night, Margaret finally opened Clara's last letter. The ink was faded, the paper brittle. October 12th, 1987. This is the end. Carl says he won't keep quiet anymore. Deke agrees. I begged them to stop, but Earl swore if they broke the pact, we'd all pay. Dean said the same. They're meeting under the tree tonight. If this is my last letter, tell Clara I loved her. Tell her I was sorry. Margaret folded the page with trembling hands. The date seared into her mind. October 12th, the night they vanished. The night the pact had claimed them all. Her father had stood up. He had refused to silence, and for that, he had been buried with the rest. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears burning her eyes. She whispered into the quiet, to the man who had been gone for so long. I'll finish it for you, Daddy. I'll tell the truth, but outside, in the damp night, the black pickup idled once more, watching, waiting. The morning came gray and heavy, the kind of Texas dawn where the sky seemed weighed down by its own secrets. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Jonah, the last of Clara's letters between them. Neither had spoken much since reading it. The words still hung in the air like smoke. If this is my last letter, tell Clara I loved her. Margaret rubbed her temples. We can't let her walk away alone. She's in danger. You saw the truck last night. Jonah closed his notebook. She's been living under their shadow for 30 years. Maybe she knows how to hide better than we do. But even as he said it, doubt clouded his eyes. Margaret stood. I'm going to her house. Jonah didn't argue. He just grabbed his jacket and followed. Clara Riley's home sat on the edge of town, a squat bungalow with peeling paint and a yard choked with weeds. Margaret pulled into the gravel drive, heart tight. The curtains were drawn, no smoke from the chimney. She knocked, once, twice. No answer. "Clara," she called. Jonah circled to the back, returning a moment later, face pale. "Doors open." Inside, the air was stale, as if the house itself had held its breath. The kitchen table was set with a half-eaten breakfast, toast gone stiff, coffee cold in the mug. Margaret's stomach sank. "Clara!" Her voice cracked. Silence. Jonah checked the bedroom. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled, but Clara was gone. On the dresser sat a single object, a scrap of cloth, torn, with a smear of mud across it. Margaret recognized the pattern. Clara's raincoat. Her throat closed. They took her. Jonah's jaw tightened. They don't forgive broken silence. They left quickly, Margaret's nerves buzzing like live wire. Back at her house, Jonah spread the letters across the table again. "This changes everything," he said. "Clara's disappearance proves the pact is still enforced. Whoever's behind it, Dean, maybe others. They're watching all of us." Margaret's voice shook. "She came to me for help. Now she's gone. Just like my father. Just like the others." Jonah leaned forward. "Then we double down. We find what they buried." He rifled through his satchel and pulled out a thin file. "I've been chasing rumors about county records that never made it public. Land surveys, mineral rights, archaeological notes. They're locked in the archive under the courthouse." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And you think they'll show what the men found?" Jonah nodded. "If we can get access, we might know what's under that soil. What they swore to keep hidden." Margaret's chest tightened. "And if it isn't just bones?" Jonah's gaze was steady. "Then it's worse." That evening, Margaret sat alone with her father's photograph. His smile was soft, his eyes warm, a face that had carried her on his shoulders and tucked her in at night. She touched the glass, whispering, "I won't let them erase you." But even as she spoke, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her hand trembled as she answered. "Hello?" A man's voice rasped, low and steady. "You couldn't keep Clara safe. What makes you think you'll do any better for yourself?" Margaret's blood ran cold. "Where is she?" The line went silent. Then a click. Dead. Margaret collapsed into the chair, shaking. Jonah appeared in the doorway, having overheard. His face hardened. "They want you scared. Don't give them what they want." But fear had already seeped into her bones. She realized then, it wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about surviving long enough to speak it. The Barton Hollow courthouse loomed over the square like a relic that had outlived its purpose. Its limestone walls were stained with decades of weather. The clock tower stuck permanently at 12. Margaret and Jonah parked on the side street, their headlights cutting briefly across shuttered storefronts before going dark. It was close to midnight. The square lay empty, shadows stretching long across the cracked pavement. "You're sure about this?" Margaret whispered as they walked toward the courthouse steps. Jonah adjusted his satchel, his notebook tucked under one arm. "If the county buried records, they'll be down in the basement archive. I've been inside before. They never throw anything away. They just lock it behind thicker doors." Margaret's pulse thudded in her ears. "And if someone's waiting? Then we hope they're as tired as this town." The front doors were locked, but Jonah produced a thin set of keys. Margaret gave him a startled look. He shrugged. "Old habit. A reporter's only as good as the doors he can open." The key turned with a reluctant click, and the doors creaked wide. Inside, the courthouse smelled of mildew and dust. Their footsteps echoed across the marble floor, too loud, too exposed. Jonah led her down a narrow stairwell, the bulb overhead flickering. At the bottom, a steel door barred their way. He knelt, working the lock with careful precision, his breath steady. When it finally gave, the stale air of the archive rushed out like a held breath. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the dark, sagging under boxes and binders. Dust motes drifted in their flashlight beams. Margaret shivered, the weight of silence pressing down. "Where do we start?" she asked. Jonah scanned the room. Land deeds, survey reports, anything tied to the field's property? They worked methodically, pulling boxes, rifling through brittle pages. Hours slipped by, the courthouse settling with groans and creaks. Margaret's eyes burned, her fingers blackened with dust. Then Jonah froze. "Here." He set a file on the table, the cover stamped County Survey, 1968. Inside were maps of the field's land, notations scrawled in pencil. One section was circled in red, the ground near the cottonwood tree. Margaret leaned close. "What's that note say?" Jonah squinted. "Subterranean void. Recommend excavation." Her stomach lurched. "A void? Like a cave? Or a pit?" Jonah murmured. He flipped to another page. An unsigned report described human remains of small stature, uncovered during preliminary digging. No follow-up, no police report. Just a stamped word across the bottom, "Closed." Margaret's chest tightened. They knew. All those years ago. They knew there were children buried out there, Jonah nodded grimly. And someone made sure it never left this room. A noise broke the silence. The faint scrape of a shoe against concrete. Margaret's breath caught. She snapped off her flashlight. Jonah did the same. The archive plunged into darkness. Another step echoed down the hall. Slow, deliberate. Margaret's pulse thundered. She clutched Jonah's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. The footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside the steel door. The knob rattled. Jonah leaned close, his whisper barely audible. "We locked it behind us." The knob rattled again, harder this time. Then silence. Margaret bit back a gasp, straining to hear. The air was thick, suffocating. Finally, the sound of retreating steps echoed up the stairwell. The door stayed shut. Jonah exhaled slowly, his hand trembling as he wiped sweat from his brow. "They knew we'd come." Margaret's voice shook. "Then we don't have much time." They gathered what they could, maps, reports, photocopies, and shoved them into Jonah's satchel. Every creak of the shelves, every groan of the courthouse walls made Margaret flinch. When they finally slipped back into the night air, the square was deserted. But a single black pickup idled at the far corner, its headlights off. Jonah grabbed her arm. "Don't look. Just walk." They reached the car, climbed in, and pulled away. Margaret's hands shook on the wheel as she checked the rearview mirror. The pickup followed at a distance, never closing, never falling away. It tailed them all the way to her driveway, then stopped at the corner, engine rumbling low. Jonah's face was grim. "They're not hiding anymore." They want us to know they're watching. Margaret stared at the satchel on the seat between them, the weight of the stolen records pressing heavy. "They can watch all they want," she whispered. "We've got the truth now." But as she spoke, the truck's headlights flared, flooding the street with blinding light. And in that moment, Margaret realized truth alone wouldn't save them. The headlights blazed into Margaret's living room, flooding the walls with harsh white light. She stood frozen by the window, Jonah at her side, the satchel of courthouse records clutched to his chest like contraband. For nearly a minute, the black pickup idled at the corner. The engine's low growl filled the night, steady, patient, unhurried. Then the light snapped off. The truck rolled backward into shadow, swallowed by the trees lining the street. Jonah muttered, "They're letting us know the leash is short." Margaret couldn't unclench her fists. "Then we tighten ours. Tomorrow we go to Reyes." "Tonight," Jonah said, his jaw set. "If we wait, those files may disappear again. Or we might. The station was dark when they arrived. Midnight had drained the town of motion. But the side lot held 2 cruisers. Jonah pounded on the glass until a weary officer appeared. "Detective Reyes," Jonah demanded. "Now!" Within minutes, Reyes joined them in the lobby, shirt untucked, eyes heavy with fatigue. Margaret spread the files across a table, her hands trembling. Maps, survey notes, the stamped word "closed." Reyes flipped through, his brow tightening with each page. "Where did you get these?" he asked finally. Jonah leaned forward. "Buried in the courthouse basement. Locked away for decades," Reyes exhaled. "You realize breaking into county property is—" "Don't!" Margaret snapped. "Don't tell me about laws when children were left in the ground." Silence stretched. Reyes closed the folder, his jaw tight. "I'll need time to verify. Chain of custody is a mess now. If I show this to Austin without context, they'll bury it again. We need a plan." Jonah's voice rose. "A plan?" Reyes' 5 men vanished. Margaret's brother among them. "These files prove cover-up. If you don't move now, you're part of it." Reyes' eyes flicked toward Margaret, softening. "Give me one night. I'll push this through the right channels. No leaks, no whispers. Tomorrow we act reluctantly." Jonah nodded. Margaret's gut twisted, but exhaustion left her numb. They returned to her house near dawn, the air damp with fog. Margaret barely managed to close her eyes before a sound tore her awake. Glass shattering. She bolted upright. Jonah was already at the door. A brick lay in the middle of her living room, shards of glass glittering around it. Attached was a note, words scrawled in red paint. "Stop digging, or we bury you next." Margaret's throat tightened. Jonah snatched up the brick, his face pale. "They're escalating." Her voice shook. "We go back to Reyes now." But when they arrived at the station, the mood was different. Officers moved briskly, hushed, their eyes avoiding contact. Reyes wasn't there. The desk sergeant shifted uncomfortably. "Detective Reyes took leave this morning. Family emergency." Jonah slammed his fist on the counter. "Family emergency? He told us—" "Sir," the sergeant interrupted firmly. "That's all I can say." Margaret's heart pounded. Reyes wasn't a man who walked away mid-investigation. Something had forced him out. By evening, they met in Jonah's kitchen, blinds drawn. The files lay between them. Margaret could barely swallow her coffee. "What if Reyes was silenced?" she whispered. Jonah rubbed his temples. "Then it's us." "Just us now." A sound interrupted him, the low rumble of an engine outside. Margaret's chest clenched. She peeked through the curtain. The black pickup sat across the street, engine idling, its windows blackened. "Jonah," she whispered. He pulled her back. "Stay away from the window." A figure climbed out, tall, broad-shouldered, face shadowed beneath a cap. He walked deliberately toward the house. Jonah grabbed the nearest thing, a heavy wrench from the counter. "Back door." Now Margaret hesitated, every nerve screaming to freeze. The figure's footsteps crunched closer. Jonah shoved her toward the kitchen door. "Go!" They bolted into the yard, stumbling through wet grass. Behind them, the front door crashed open, wood splintering. Margaret's lungs burned as they tore through the alley. A shout rang out behind them, then the thunder of pursuit. Jonah yanked her into the darkness between 2 sheds, pressing her against the wall, both of them gasping. A silhouette moved across the alley mouth, paused, listened. Margaret held her breath until her chest ached. Finally, the figure moved on. The sound of boots faded. Jonah's whisper was ragged. "They're done warning us." Margaret's hands trembled violently. She thought of the files, still spread across his kitchen table, evidence left behind like bait. "They'll destroy it all," she whispered. Jonah nodded grimly. "Then we burn it into memory. Every line, every map. They can't erase what we know. In that moment, Margaret understood. The Cottonwood Pact wasn't just an old secret. It was alive, ruthless, and willing to kill to stay buried. And they were already inside its jaws. Dawn seeped over Barton Hollow, pale and thin, as Margaret